the spring of 1994, on a 43-acre farm at the edge of Hardin County, Ohio, a 41-year-old woman named Lorraine Specht walked out to the back pasture where her late husband had run cattle for 11 years and started pulling up fence posts with a digging bar and a pair of leather gloves that had been his before they were hers. Her neighbor to the east, a man named Glenn Boatwright, who had farmed corn and soybeans on 300 acres, since his father handed him the keys in 1971, watched her from his truck on the county road for about 4 minutes before he drove on. He did not stop. He had already heard what Lorraine was planning to do with that pasture, and he had already formed his opinion about it, and his opinion was the same as most of Kenton's opinion, which was that grief made people strange and the bank was going to end up with the Specht place inside of 3 years. Lorraine did not know Glenn Boatwright was watching. She was thinking about fence posts. She pulled 17 of them that morning. Her daughter, 22-year-old Britt, brought her a thermos of coffee at 10 o'clock and stood at the edge of the cleared ground without saying anything. Britt had come home from Columbus 2 months ago when her father died, and she had not gone back, and Lorraine had not asked her to stay, and had not asked her to go. Britt was the kind of young woman who made her own decisions and informed you afterward, which was a quality Lorraine recognized because she had raised it into her on purpose. "Mom," Britt said, "I know. You haven't told me what you're doing out here. I'll tell you when it's working." That was in April. By June, the back pasture had been divided into 8 growing sections with low wire fencing, and in those sections, Lorraine Specht had planted 640 ginseng roots under a shade cloth canopy she had built herself from conduit pipe and agricultural fabric she had ordered from a supplier in Pennsylvania. She had also planted, along the north fence line, a staggered double row of black cohosh and golden seal, and in the cleared strip along the creek bank, a stand of elderberry and spice bush that she transplanted from the woodlot on the far side of the property. The people of Kenton, Ohio, did not know what to make of this. They knew what corn was. They knew what soybeans were. They knew what cattle were. They did not know what ginseng was, not in any useful sense. And the ones who did know what it was knew it as something you dug out of the woods and sold for pocket money, not something a widow with a mortgage planted on 43 acres as a primary crop. By August, the story had moved through Hardin County, the way stories move through small Ohio farming communities, which is to say, it traveled from the grain elevator to the diner on Main Street to the back row of the Methodist Church on Sunday morning, and it arrived at each stop slightly more alarming than it had been when it left the previous one. By the time the story reached the booth in the back of Russ's diner, where 4 men ate breakfast every weekday, at 6:30 in the morning, it had acquired the quality of confirmed disaster. The 4 men were Glenn Boatwright, a man named Phil Ostergaard, who ran the Hardin County Extension Office and had been running it since 1981, a farm lender named Ray Detweiler from the First Ag Bank on Courthouse Square, and a retired veterinarian named Howard Cruz, who had nothing better to do at 6:30 in the morning and had been eating at Russ's since 1978 and was not about to stop. Glenn Boatwright had seen the fence posts come out. Oh, guy. Phil Ostergaard had received a phone call from Lorraine in January asking about shade requirements for American ginseng cultivation, and he had told her it was an interesting question and looked it up and called her back with 3 bullet points and had not thought about it again until the stories started in August. Ray Detweiler held the operating note on the Specht farm and had held it through 4 years of Carl Specht's cattle operation, and was now watching the cattle gone and the pasture converted, and a woman with no commercial farming background planting roots under a tent. Howard Cruz had no financial interest in the matter. He simply had opinions, and breakfasts were where he put them. "The market for that root is China," Phil Ostergaard said one morning in September. "It's a traditional medicine product. The export market is real. I looked it up after she called me. What's the price per pound?" Ray Detweiler said, "Dry weight, cultivated root, around $40 to $60 a pound in a good year. Wild simulated can go higher. How long until harvest?" 5 to 7 years for the root to reach marketable size. The four men sat with that for a moment. "So she's planning to grow something for 5 to 7 years that she can't eat, can't feed to anything, and sells to China," Glenn Boatwright said. "That's about the size of it," Howard Cruz said. Ray Detweiler picked up his coffee. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had approved Lorraine's operating note for the current year at Carl's death, under the assumption that she would continue the cattle operation or sell the herd and plant row crops, and that neither of those things had happened. He would need to have a conversation with her before spring. What? None of the four men knew, because none of them had asked, was that Lorraine Specht had been planning this for 11 years. She had grown up in Hardin County, the second of 4 children of a woman named Eunice Specht, no relation to Carl's family, who kept a large kitchen garden and a serious interest in medicinal plants that she had learned from her own mother, who had learned it from hers, going back to a dry July, back to a German farming family that had come to Ohio in the 1850s and had never entirely trusted the idea that a farm should grow only one thing and sell it to one buyer. Lorraine's mother grew vegetables. She also grew chamomile and valerian and echinacea and sold the dried product to a natural foods co-op in Findlay through the 1970s and into the 1980s, when the market for that kind of thing went from small to serious. Lorraine had watched her mother read every publication that came out of Purdue and Ohio State on medicinal herb cultivation. She had watched her keep ledgers with the same discipline she kept the kitchen. She had helped harvest and dry and package product since she was 9 years old, and she had learned, without being formally taught, that the difference between a farm that survived and a farm that failed was usually the difference between one income stream and 4. She had married Carl Specht in 1980, a cattle farmer's son from Hardin County who was kind and steady and committed to the operation his father had built. And she had understood that Carl's farm was a cattle farm, and she had not tried to change it while Carl was alive. She had kept a medicinal herb garden behind the house that was larger than a kitchen garden and smaller than a commercial plot, and she had sold dried herbs to a food co-op in Columbus every fall, and the money went into a savings account that Carl knew about and did not ask about, the way that people in long marriages sometimes have a corner of things that belongs to them alone. Carl died in January of 1994 of a heart attack at 51 years old, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning, which was the kind of specific detail that Lorraine remembered for the rest of her life in the way that people remember the ordinary details of extraordinary moments. He was 51. Lorraine was 41. Their daughter Britt was 22, and in Columbus, doing something with graphic design that Lorraine didn't entirely understand, but that Britt clearly did. Their son, Miles, was 19, and in his second year at Ohio State, studying agriculture, which had surprised Lorraine and pleased her. She buried Carl on a Friday in January in ground that was frozen 2 inches down, and she spent the rest of that winter going through everything she had saved over 11 years. Not the ledgers, which she knew. Not the bank statements, which she knew. She went through the folder she kept in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, the folder that contained 11 years of photocopied articles from the Journal of Alternative Agriculture, 3 years of correspondence with a researcher at the University of Kentucky who studied Appalachian ginseng cultivation, 2 booklets from a growers' cooperative in West Virginia, and a set of her own handwritten notes that she had been adding to since 1986, and that by 1994 were 47 pages long in a spiral notebook. She had not shown the folder to anyone. She had not shown it to Carl, not because he would have objected, but because it was not yet time, and she had understood that it would not be time until it was her farm, in the way that it could not be her farm, while Carl was alive and well, and running cattle on it. That was not a wish. It was simply a fact, the way a seed is a fact, before the ground is ready for it. By the 1st of March, she had decided what she was going to do with the back pasture. She was going to do what her mother had done, which was going to do what her mother, which was refused to grow only one thing, and she was going to it on a commercial scale her mother had never attempted. Because the market that had been small in 1975 was not small anymore. Here is what Lorraine Specht knew that the men at Russ's Diner did not know. She knew that American ginseng cultivated under proper shade conditions could yield 600 to 900 pounds of dry root per acre after 6 to 7 years, and that the wholesale price for certified Appalachian region cultivated root had been running between $45 and $70 per pound, with premium wild simulated root commanding up to 120. She knew that the export market to East Asia was not speculative. It was a documented growing trade that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service tracked annually because wild ginseng was a regulated export. She knew that the risk in ginseng cultivation was disease management and patience, not market access. She had written to 3 commercial growers in Wisconsin and Tennessee and had received detailed letters back because people who grew ginseng for a living were, as a category, more willing to share information than corn farmers were, possibly because there were fewer of them. She had a folder 47 pages thick. She had not mentioned it to Phil Ostergaard when he gave her the 3 bullet points over the phone. She had not mentioned it to Ray Detweiler when she came in to discuss the operating note in February. She had said only that she was converting the back pasture to specialty crops. Ray Detweiler had asked what kind of specialty crops. Lorraine had told him perennial herbs with export market potential. Ray had written that down and had not looked it up. The first summer was hot and dry, and the shade cloth did its job. The ginseng seeds she had planted in the fall of 1993, before Carl died, before anyone knew she was doing anything other than fall garden work, germinated in May and sent up their first paired leaves in June. She walked the rows every morning before 7. She hand-pulled every weed in the beds because ginseng root was worth nothing if it was contaminated by competing root systems, and her hands were the cheapest and most accurate weeding tool available. Britt helped on weekends without being asked. The black cohosh along the north fence was doing what black cohosh did, which was grow slowly and steadily and ask for almost nothing. The elderberry along the creek was doing better than expected. Lorraine had been selling elderberry to the Columbus Co-op since 1991, and she knew the root system and the light requirements and the harvest timeline, and the light requirement, and the creek bank location was giving the plants exactly what they needed. In October of 1994, Ray Detweiler called and asked her to come in for a review of the operating note. She came. She brought her ledger. She brought a 3-page typed summary of projected income by crop and by year for 1994 through 2001. She brought a copy of a pricing analysis from the Wisconsin Ginseng Board that documented average wholesale prices for the previous 10 years. She placed the pricing analysis on his desk. Ray picked it up. He read the first paragraph. He set it down. "Mrs. Specht," he said, "the bank's concern is the timeline. 5 to 7 years is a long time to be servicing a note without a primary harvest. The elderberry will come into production next fall. The black cohosh in year 3. The ginseng in year 6 at the earliest. The note will be serviced from the elderberry and from the small herb operation in the interim years. I have been servicing a smaller version of this operation out of pocket for 11 years, and I have documentation of every sale." She put the documentation on his desk. 11 years of co-op sales receipts, organized by year, held together with a binder clip. Ray Detweiler looked at the stack. He had not known about the co-op sales. Carl had not mentioned them, and Ray had not asked. "The bank is not accustomed to this type of operation," he said. "I understand that. The note is secured against the property, same as it always was. The property is 43 acres of Hardin County ground with a house and outbuildings, and it will be worth at least what it was worth when Carl took the original mortgage regardless of what I grow on it." Ray Detweiler looked at her for a long moment. He was 55 years old and had been lending money to farmers for 28 years. And he had made the kind of career that involved learning which borrowers were problems and which ones weren't, and he was trying to read Lorraine Specht and finding that she was not organizing herself into any category he had available. He approved the operating note. He told himself it was because of the property value. It was partly because of the property value. Lorraine drove home and wrote down the meeting in her notebook. She wrote down the date and Ray Detweiler's exact words. She had been writing down dates and exact words since 1980, and she had never needed to use them, but she kept them anyway, because her mother had told her that the people who never need records are the people who keep them. The second year, Phil Ostergaard drove out to the farm in March on what he described as a routine extension check-in, and which was, in fact, driven by the continuing conversation at Russ's diner. He walked the rows with Lorraine on a cold Ohio morning, hands in his pockets, looking at the beds of 2-leaf ginseng plants and the cohosh stand and the elderberry along the creek. "These are in good shape," he said, which was the first honest thing he had said since he drove in. "Yes, the shade cloth setup is unusual. I haven't seen this done at this scale in Hardin County. I don't imagine you have. I looked up some of the university work on this after you called." He paused. "There are growers in Marathon County, Wisconsin doing this on 80-acre plots. The yields they're reporting are consistent with what you told Ray Detweiler." Lorraine said nothing. "I should have looked it up before I gave you the 3 bullet points," Phil said. "You answered my question, the question I asked." Phil Ostergaard nodded. He was a conscientious man who had gotten into extension work because he genuinely wanted to help farmers and had discovered over 15 years that helping farmers sometimes meant learning things you hadn't known when the farmer first called. "What can I do?" he said. "Going forward." "Nothing yet. Ask me again in year 4. He did. He came back in 1997, and he came back again in 1998, and by 1998 he was telling the story at the State Extension Conference in Columbus as an example of non-traditional crop integration in Ohio County agriculture. And 3 other extension agents from other counties drove out to the Specht farm that fall to walk the rows themselves, and Lorraine walked with them and answered their questions, and when they left, she went back inside and wrote down what they had asked. The third year was the year of Glenn Boatwright. Glenn was 56. In 1996, a tall man with sun-damaged hands who had grown up believing that Hardin County soil was corn and bean soil because it had always been corn and bean soil, and he had never had a compelling reason to think otherwise. He had watched Lorraine's operation from across the fence line for 2 years with the specific patience of a man waiting for a prediction to come true, and the prediction's own was not coming true, which was its own kind of unsettling. What moved him in the end was not a conversation and not a piece of evidence. It was a Thursday afternoon in September of 1996 when he drove past the Specht Farm Road and saw Lorraine's truck parked beside the elderberry rows and Lorraine herself standing in the creek bank, planting with a hand scale and a harvest bin, and he pulled over and watched for a minute before he realized he was watching the way he had watched in April of 1994 when she was pulling fence posts, and that, in both cases, he had been waiting for something to go wrong, and it had not gone wrong, and he was now 2.5 years into waiting, and the farm was still there, and the plants were still there, and she was standing in a harvest row in September, looking like a woman who was not surprised by anything she saw. He did not stop the truck. He drove on. He stopped speaking about the Specht operation at Russ's Diner, not because he had changed his mind completely, but because he had run out of things to say that he was still confident were true. The fourth year was the year Lorraine almost lost everything, and it had nothing to do with ginseng. In the early spring of 1997, a groundwater contamination report filed with the Ohio EPA identified agricultural runoff from a tiling project on the Boatwright farm as a potential source of nitrate contamination in the creek that ran along the south edge of the Specht property, the creek that ran through Lorraine's elderberry planting, the creek whose water she used to supplement drip irrigation on the cohosh beds in dry stretches. The EPA investigation took 4 months. During those 4 months, Lorraine could not certify her creek-adjacent plants as uncontaminated for the organic co-op she sold to. She lost the elderberry harvest for 1997 entirely. She lost the co-op contract pending resolution, which was the primary income she had been running the farm on during the establishment years of the ginseng. She did not file a civil suit against Glenn Boatwright. She had a lawyer look at her options, and the lawyer told her the contamination levels were at the low end of the EPA threshold, and a civil case would cost more than she stood to recover. She paid the lawyer for the consultation, wrote down the amount in her ledger and the date and what she had been told, and did not file a suit. She spent that fall and winter working on getting certified through a second distributor in Cincinnati that did not require creek-adjacent certification. She reformulated her elderberry planting, moving new growth to the higher ground on the west side of the pasture. She borrowed $11,000 from her sister in Salina to cover the operating shortfall that year. She did not tell the men at Russ's Diner that she had borrowed from her sister. She did not tell anyone in Kenton. She paid her sister back in 18 months. Glenn Boatwright did not know what the contamination had cost her until 1999, when Phil Ostergaard mentioned it in a passing remark at a Farm Bureau meeting, and Glenn drove home from that meeting and sat in his kitchen for a long time. He had not intended to contaminate her creek. The tiling project had been permitted. The runoff levels were borderline. He had not known about her irrigation use of the creek. None of that changed what it had cost her. He came to see her that November. He drove up the farm road on a gray morning and knocked on the door and took off his cap when she answered. He was 59 years old. "Mrs. Specht," he said. "Glenn, I wanted to talk to you about 1997, right? All right. I didn't know you were irrigating from that creek. I know you didn't. It cost you. It did. He looked at his cap in his hands. I've been watching this place for 4 years. I had it figured as something that wasn't going to work. I know that, too. I was wrong about that. I want you to know I was wrong about it. Lorraine studied him for a moment. She had thought about this conversation, or a version of it, for 2 years without expecting it to happen. You want to come in, she said. I have coffee. He came in. He stayed for 40 minutes. He told her that he had been talking to his son about diversifying a section of the boatwright ground, and he wanted to know whether she thought ginseng was viable at smaller scale. She told him what she knew without withholding anything. She told him to start with less than an acre and spend 2 years learning the disease management before he scaled. She told him to call the extension office in Hardin County, Wisconsin, because they had the best resource library on the topic in the Midwest. He thanked her and left. He did not go back to talking about her operation at Russ's diner. He did something she had not expected, which was that he started telling people she knew what she was doing, in the flat, matter-of-fact way that a Hardin County farmer in his late 50s told people things that he had decided were true. The 5th and 6th years were the years when the farm stopped being a story people told with concern and started being a story people told with different feelings they could not quite name. The elderberry from the West Side replanting came into full production in 1998. The black cohosh was ready for its first partial harvest in 1999. The sales through the Cincinnati distributor held at a level that covered the note and the household, and produced a surplus that went into the savings account Lorraine had held at a bank in Findlay since 1985. Miles came home from Ohio State in 1997 with a degree in agricultural science and a long list of questions about soil chemistry that he had been building since the summer of 1995, when he'd walked the ginseng beds on a visit home and realized his mother was doing something the university hadn't mentioned in any of his coursework. He did not come home to take over the farm. He came home because he was 22 and curious, and the most interesting operation in Hardin County happened to be the one he'd grown up on. He worked the farm through 1998 and 1999 alongside Lorraine. He took the soil samples. He ran the drip system upgrades. He negotiated the second distributor contract because he was 25 and spoke the distributor's language more fluently than Lorraine did, which was a fact she acknowledged without finding it difficult. Ray Detweiler retired from the First Ag Bank in 1999. His replacement was a younger lender named Stacy Burrell, who came out to the Specht farm in February of 2000 for an introduction meeting and spent the first 20 minutes listening to Lorraine explain the crop rotation and the harvest timeline and the pricing structure, and spent the next 20 minutes asking questions that were better than any Ray Detweiler had asked in 6 years, and drove back to the bank with a loan file she understood for the first time since it landed on her desk. The first ginseng harvest came in the fall of 2001. Lorraine had 640 roots in the ground. She harvested 3/4 of them that October, leaving 1/4 in the ground for seed production. Miles ran the washing and drying setup they had built in the second outbuilding the previous winter. Britt came home from Columbus for the week of the harvest. She did not do this because Lorraine asked her to. She did it because it was the thing her mother had been building toward for 7 years. And Britt had never, not once, doubted it would happen. The dried yield from the 2001 harvest was 480 pounds. Lorraine sold it through 3 buyers. One was the Cincinnati distributor. One was a broker in New York who exported to Hong Kong. One was a direct buyer she had corresponded with in Vancouver, who paid a premium for certified origin Appalachian region root. The average price across the 3 sales came to $67 a pound. The income from ginseng in 2001 was $32,160. The total gross from the Specht farm that year, ginseng, elderberry, black cohosh, and the small batch dried herb line she sold through the co-op, was $49,300. The 43-acre farm that Carl Specht had run as a mid-scale cattle operation, with a gross of $22,000 in its best year, had, in the fall of 2001, produced more than twice that income on the same ground, with no livestock, no feed costs, no veterinary expenses, and a mortgage that was being paid 3 months ahead of schedule. Lorraine did not call anyone to tell them. She wrote the number in her ledger, in the same blue ink she had been using since 1994. In the same column format, and she closed the ledger and put it in the desk drawer and went to bed. The men at Russ's diner heard about the harvest from Phil Ostergaard, who heard about it from Stacy Burrell, who had no particular reason not to mention it to Phil since he was the county extension director. And this was, by any measure, an agricultural success story in his county. By December of 2001, the number had moved through Kenton with the same energy that the original story had moved in 7 years moved through Kenton 7 years earlier, except that the tone was different. Glenn Boatwright heard the number on a Saturday morning. He drove home and did the math on his own ground, and sat in his kitchen doing the math again from a different angle. Howard Crooks said at the diner that January that anybody who had told Lorraine Specht she was wrong about that pasture owed her something, which was as close as Howard Crooks had gotten to an apology about anything in 20 years of breakfast opinions. Ray Detweiler was in Florida. He did not hear about it until his son mentioned it at Christmas, and he sat with it for a while, and then he wrote Lorraine a short letter from Sarasota that arrived in February of 2002, and said, among other things, that he had looked at the dry July that looked at the Wisconsin Ginseng Board pricing analysis she had put on his desk in 1994, and had not read past the first paragraph, and that he wished he had read further, and that the farm appeared to be doing well, and he was glad of it. She wrote him back. The letter was 4 sentences. By the spring of 2002, the Ohio State Agricultural Extension Service had contacted Lorraine about a publication they were producing on alternative crop integration for small and mid-size Ohio farms. They wanted to use the Specht operation as a case study. She said yes on the condition that they be accurate about the timeline. The researcher who came out in April was a young woman from Columbus who had been studying medicinal herb cultivation for her dissertation, and who arrived expecting a successful eccentric and left with 40 pages of notes on methodology, soil management, and market development that she had not expected to find. The case study ran in the extension publication in the fall of 2002. It was reprinted in the Ohio Farmer magazine in early 2003. By that fall, Lorraine had received 61 letters and phone calls from farmers across Ohio, Indiana, and West Virginia asking about the operation. She answered every one of them by letter or by phone in the evenings after the workday was done. Miles stayed. He was 29 by 2002 and had turned down 2 other positions, one with a seed company and one with the county itself, because what was happening on the 43 acres his mother had rebuilt was more interesting than anything else he had been offered. He took over the soil management entirely. He expanded the elderberry stand by 2 acres. He began a small trial planting of valerian, that would become a fourth income stream by 2005. Britt stayed in Columbus but came home for harvest weeks every fall. And her children, when they came, grew up thinking of the farm the way farm children think of the land they're raised on, which is to say they thought of it as permanent, as given, as the thing that would be there when everything else changed. In 2007, the Hardin County Farm Bureau invited Lorraine to speak at the annual meeting. She was 54 years old and had not spoken publicly about the operation except to researchers and phone callers and the occasional reporter. She almost said no. Miles convinced her. She stood at a lectern in the VFW Hall in Kenton in November with a single notacard in her hand, looked at it once, and put it in her jacket pocket. "People ask me why I planted ginseng in a cattle pasture in 1994, she said. "That's the wrong question. The right question is why anyone in Ohio thought that 43 acres should be growing only one thing and selling it to one buyer at whatever price that buyer decided to pay that year." She paused. "My grandmother grew 6 things on 20 acres in Putnam County. My mother grew 8. The reason we moved away from that in this part of Ohio wasn't because row crops or cattle were more productive per acre. It was because they were easier to finance, easier to insure, easier to fit into a bank's spreadsheet. We built the system around the lender's convenience, and then we forgot that's what we'd done, and we started thinking the simple farm was the natural farm. It isn't. The land in Hardin County is not naturally a single crop acre. It's naturally a complicated acre, and you can either work with that or spend a lot of money working against it." She stopped for a moment. Glenn Boatwright was in the 3rd row. He was 69 years old. He had been growing ginseng on a trial plot of half an acre since 2000 and was expanding to 2 acres in the spring. In 1997, a contamination event wiped out my elderberry harvest and cost me my primary distributor. I borrowed money from my sister, and I did not tell anyone in this county that I had done it, because I was not sure at that moment that I hadn't made a mistake that was going to catch up with me. I had been planning this farm since 1986. I had a notebook 47 pages long, and there was a moment in 1997 when I sat in my kitchen and held that notebook and thought, what if I was wrong? The room was quiet. I wasn't wrong. But I want you to understand that the confidence people see on a farm after 20 years is not what was there in the middle years. What was there in the middle years was a notebook and a distribution contact and an $11,000 loan from my sister and the decision to keep going anyway. She stepped back from the lectern. The room came back to noise slowly, the way rooms do when something has been said that people need a moment to absorb before they can respond to it. Glenn Boatwright found her in the parking lot afterward. He was wearing his good coat. He had his cap in his hands. "Lorraine," he said. "Glenn, I want to say something I should have said in 1994. "Ah, all right. I watched you pull those fence posts and I drove on. I should have stopped and asked what you were doing. You had your own farm to run. I had my own opinions to protect," he said. "That's what I had." She looked at him for a moment. He was an honest man. He always had been, which was part of what had made him so certain he was right. "You came to see me in 1999, she said. "You sat in my kitchen. You asked me what you should know before you started." I did. That counted, Glenn. That counted for a lot." He nodded. He put his cap on. He shook her hand the way he would have shaken hands with a man whose judgment he trusted, which was what she was. The Specht farm is still there. Miles runs the daily operation now, with a part-time crew during harvest and a full-time Hyatt who came out of the Ohio State program in 2019, specifically because she had read the case study in the extension publication. and wanted to work on a farm that she described to her advisor as the most interesting small-scale polyculture operation in the state. The 43 acres carry 6 crop lines in 2024. The ginseng planting has been replanted twice since 2001 and now runs on a 6-year rolling cycle that produces a harvest every fall from different sections of the ground. The elderberry operations supplies 3 distributors. The Valerian and Black Cohosh go to 2 pharmaceutical manufacturers who source domestically for quality control reasons. The farm that Carl Specht ran as a cattle operation with a peak gross of $22,000 is valued today at roughly 4 times what it was valued at when Lorraine pulled the first fence post in April of 1994. The surrounding row crop ground, which was worth more than the Specht place when she started, has appreciated at roughly half the rate over the same period. Ray Detweiler died in 2014 in Sarasota. Glenn Boatwright retired from active farming in 2016, and his son runs the Boatwright ground now, with a half-acre ginseng trial that expanded to 12 acres in 2021. Phil Ostergaard retired from the Extension Office in 2010 and still lives in Kenton and still comes to the Farm Bureau meetings. Howard Cruse died in 2009. His last recorded opinion on the Specht farm, delivered at Russ's Diner in the fall of 2008, was that it was the best managed operation in the county, which was saying something because the county had some good operations, but it was a dry July. But this one was different because the woman who built it by knowing something that nobody around her knew. And she had waited until she could prove it, and she had never once explained herself to people who hadn't earned the explanation. Nobody at the diner disagreed with him. Lorraine Specht is 71 years old now. She walks the ginseng beds every morning before 7, the way she has done since 1994. The plants are not the same plants. The beds have been replanted twice, but the rows are in the same ground she cleared when she pulled those fence posts, the same back pasture where cattle had grazed for 11 years before she decided that the land had been waiting the whole time to be something more than one thing. She does not think of it as vision. She thinks of it as a notebook 47 pages long, and a sister who lent her money without asking for a reason, and a morning in April of 1994 when she walked out to a pasture with a digging bar and a pair of leather gloves and started.